The big question: what factors contributed to the Inca Empire becoming the largest pre-Columbian empire? Chapter 7: Birth of the Inca Empire. Travel south in your mind now, leaving behind the volcanic mountains and jungles of Central America. As you wind your way down into South America, you will cross the equator. You will pass through more lush rainforests in the Amazon River basin. Continue west in the direction of the Pacific Ocean. You will soon discover that there is no way to reach the ocean without crossing the Andes Mountains. This mountain range is one of the highest and longest in the world. In the 1300s, the Aztec created an empire in Mexico, and the Inca built an empire in the Andes. These civilizations developed nearly 3,000 miles apart. There is no evidence to suggest that the two empires had any direct knowledge of one another. According to legend, the sun god chose the birthplace of the Inca civilization. He chose Cuzco, located in a beautiful valley in present-day Peru, as the place where the Quechua people should settle. They lived mostly in small farming communities for about 200 years. Then, in 1438 CE, a powerful enemy threatened the Quechua's way of life. The Quechua defeated this enemy, greatly increasing their power. The size of the Quechua army grew. With Cuzco as their base, they began to conquer other indigenous groups throughout the Andes Mountains. An empire was born. The Quechua called their empire Tawantinsuyu, meaning land of four quarters. They divided the empire into 4 areas or quarters, some much larger than others. Cuzco was at the center of the empire where the 4 quarters met. The empire extended across the high Andes Mountains. From there, it dipped into sheltered valleys, windy plains, and dry coastal deserts. In the 1500s, the Spanish changed the empire's name to Inca. Today, we use the name Inca to describe the largest pre-Columbian empire ever built. Pyramid of Power. In the days of the empire, the term Inca, meaning king or lord, referred only to members of the royal family. The Inca called their emperor Sapa Inca. He ran a strong, organized government from the capital city of Cuzco. If you think of the Inca society structure as a pyramid, the Sapa Inca was at the top. He ruled supreme above all others. The Inca believed that the Sapa Inca was descended from Inti, the sun god. Heredity determined who would become emperor, meaning that when the emperor died, his son would become the next ruler. If the Sapa Inca had more than one son, he chose the strongest of his sons to replace him. People treated the Sapa Inca like a god. He lived in a magnificent palace, dressed in gold-fringed clothing, and ate off gold plates. Servants carried him on a golden litter. Powerful men surrounded the Sapa Inca. 4 governors helped him rule each of the empire's 4 quarters. Most government officials were nobles and members of the royal family. They included priests, judges, army officers, and tax collectors. The bottom of the pyramid consisted of the rest of society, commoners who worked for the emperor. Starting from the top, Sapa Inca, governors, government officials including priests, judges, army officers, tax collectors, commoners. Nobles and members of the royal family held high-ranking government positions. The Inca Empire was divided into 4 quarters, some much larger than others. Sapa Inca, on a golden litter. Growing food from mountain peaks to coastal plains. The success of the empire depended upon the commoners, most of whom were farmers. The Inca cultivated many different crops, including potatoes, corn, beans, peanuts, manioc, chili peppers, tomatoes, and squash. Cotton grew in the hot, dry coastal regions. Quinoa thrived in cooler, wetter mountain areas. Terrace farming was a common practice in the Andes Mountains. Like the Maya, the Inca transformed hillsides with terraces, or steps of flat land. They built raised aqueducts and irrigated their crops with water from mountain springs. The terraces helped trap water, preventing erosion and runoff. The Inca produced an abundance of food for an ever-growing empire working with simple hoes, sod-breaking clubs, and foot plows. Potatoes, potatoes, potatoes. Potatoes, native to the Andean highlands, provided food year-round. The Inca grew different varieties of potatoes along terraced garden slopes. The mountainous climate with hot days and cold nights was perfect for freeze-drying. Potatoes baked in the sun during the day and froze at night. This early method of preserving crops meant the Inca could store food for later use. Terraced fields trap water and prevent erosion. Government organization. Tribute rules for the commoners. With each new conquest, the emperor acquired new land and more commoners to work the land. The emperor controlled the land and the crops grown on it. Commoners were organized into family units of 10 to 20 people. Governors divided the land among each unit, or elu. Each elu cultivated 3 separate plots. One plot was for feeding the priests and gods, another for feeding the emperor and his nobles, and the other for feeding themselves. The governors collected some of the harvested crops and placed them in storehouses throughout the empire. Storehouse produce fed traveling armies and served as disaster relief in times of emergency. Starting from the top, farmland, harvesting crops, food being brought to a storehouse. The Inca did not use any form of money. Like the Aztecs, they had a tribute or tax system. The government collected tribute in 2 ways. First, people paid a goods tax based on the number of people in their elu. For example, commoners only kept about 1/3 of their harvest. They sent 2/3 to the gods and nobles. People also paid tribute with pottery, textiles, and gems. The second government tax was a service or labor tax called a mita. Each household chose someone, often the father, to fulfill the government's mita requirement. Some people served in the army. Others built roads and buildings. Still others worked in the mines, mining copper, tin, gold, or silver. As a result of the mita tax, the Inca built the most advanced road system in pre-Columbian South America. Serving in the army, growing crops, mining, constructing a wall. In exchange for tribute, the government took care of people. It made sure that people did not go hungry. The government cared for the sick and elderly. It made sure people in the empire had homes, so they were not homeless. As long as people obeyed the Sapa Inca's rules, they received good care. If people disobeyed, they received severe punishment. If a farmer took food from the emperor's fields, he risked being severely punished. If he condemned the gods, he would surely lose his life. The quipu, a color-coded system of counting knots. The governors used quipus to keep track of crop yields, taxes paid, and taxes owed. Each governor had his own quipu for keeping records. A quipu looked like a bundle of colorful threads. Strings hung from a central rope. The governors tied the strings in knots. The types of knots and the colors of the strings helped governors interpret calculations and records. Quipus used to record information. A superior network of roads. Inca roads created a network across different types of land. Using stone and primitive tools, Mita workers followed the land's natural terrain. They chiseled stone out of mountainsides, building tunnels to connect cities from one end of the empire to the other. They laid steps up rocky cliffs. They stacked stones and floating reeds to form causeways over marshlands. Their rope bridges, probably the first suspension bridges in the world, spanned deep valleys and rivers along the way. They built low stone walls to keep desert sands from covering the flat, wide coastal roads. They edged the roads with stone gutters to prevent flooding. They even built tambos, or inns, for travelers. Thousands of workers maintained the empire's 24,000 miles of road. The government primarily used the roads. Armies patrolled the roads, making sure commoners did not travel along them without permission. Because the Inca had no written language, the emperor kept in touch with his governors through swift-footed messengers. The emperor's messengers traveled across the empire carrying quipus. These knotted ropes contained records of everything from population figures to troop numbers to the size of animal herds. The messengers also memorized messages and transferred them orally from one person to another. They used relay stations that were set up about every mile along the roads. As one messenger approached another, he blew into a conch shell trumpet, alerting the next messenger to be ready to run. The runner told his message to the next as the two ran side by side. In this way, multiple messengers carried the same message from station to station across many miles. In fact, these highly trained sprinters traveled more than 100 miles in a single day in order to deliver messages. In this land of 4 quarters, all roads led to Cusco. Math challenge. Calculating time. It is about 2,300 miles between the present-day cities of Quito, Ecuador, and Santiago, Chile. Today, it takes about 5 hours to fly from one to the other. If Inca messengers traveled 100 miles a day, approximately how many days would it take them to deliver a message from Quito to Santiago?